in Politics, a Rising Threat to Democracy Worldwide. My name is Hayati Nufus, and I will be your host for today. Our public talk today is jointly organized by the American Institute for Indonesian Studies and Research Center for Politics, National Research and Innovation Agency, or BRIN. Therefore, I would like to greet and express my gratitude to the Honorable, the Head of Research Center for Politics, Dr. Atikah Nur Alami, and the Executive Director of IFIS, Dr. Megan Hewitt. I also would like to greet our distinguished speaker today, Prof. Mona Lina Kruk for the Department of Political Science, Rutgers University, and our moderator today, Dr. Kurniawati Hastudewi. Before we start, please allow me to inform you about the agenda of today. First, there will be a singing of our national anthem, and second, the opening speech, followed by the short introductions of the American Institute for Indonesian Studies, and move to the main agenda, the public lecture by Professor Mona Lina Kruk, guided by our moderator today, Dr. Kurniawati Hastudewi, and followed by the Q&A session. For all the participants, here are the general rules during our public talk today. First, after entering Zoom, please change your name with name _ institution. And the second, this webinar is conducted virtually from Zoom platform and live in YouTube channel of BRIN Indonesia. For those participating in Zoom, we inform that the microphone of all participants is muted by the host. Please make sure that you remain in the mute mode and click the unmute button only when speaking. Third, the Q&A session will be held after the speaker delivers her presentation and be guided by the moderator. If you have any questions for the speaker during the presentation, please type your question in the chat box along with your name and your institutions. And the last, please fill in the attendance form that can be accessed through the link shared by the committee in the chat box. Without any further ado, let's begin with our first agenda, the singing of National Anthem Indonesia Raya. The committee will be playing the National Anthem. Ladies and gentlemen, to begin our public talk today, I would like to invite the head of Research Center for Politics BRIN, Dr. Atikah Nur Alami, to deliver the welcoming remarks as well as officially open the event. Please, Dr. Atikah, the screen is yours.
Okay, thank you, Nufus. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good morning. Excellencies, honored guests, distinguished participants, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to you all on today's public talk on violence against women in politics, a rising threat to democracy worldwide. Actually, it's a great pleasure to be hosting this public talk, which is the collaborations between Research Center for Politics, the Indonesia's National Research and Innovation Agency, BRIN, and the American Institute for Indonesian Studies, or IFIS. I send my gratitude to Ms. Megan Hewitt, PhD, the Executive Director of IFIS, and all IFIS team in supporting this event. It is also my personal privilege actually to welcome and introduce Professor Mona Lina Kruk as our speaker today. Thank you, Prof. Kruk, for honoring our invitation and accepting to join us. And together with Professor Kruk, today we will discuss how political women experience violence in politics, what the problems look like, and what are the challenges posed by violence against women in politics to a democracy around the world. As we can see in many countries recently, women have been more visible as a social and political actors or activists, and women have doubled their representation in national parliaments and have been recognized as an important and influential voting population. Globally, according to data from the Inter-Parliamentary Union in late 2019, the global average of women's representation in lower houses of parliaments was 24.6%, and in Asia it was 20.1%. Meanwhile, in the case of Indonesia, I think we have to be grateful also. The proportion of women elected to the national parliament has increased from 17.36% in 2014 to 20.9% in the 2016 general elections. I can say that the number shows that despite making up almost half of the population in Indonesia, women have traditionally been underrepresented in elected positions, even after Indonesia introduced a minimum of 30% female legislative candidates for each political party contesting the election. I think we are agree also that having more women in politics will bring positive effects, because women will draw attention to a wider range of policy issues, including issues that benefit women and represent women's interests, as well as I think it will break down stereotypes about men and politics. Nevertheless, we have to also aware that there have been increasing number of sources record violence and harassment aimed at not only female politicians and activists, but also female voters. And in responding to this situation, I think numerous scholars, including Professor Kruk, have started to pay attention on violence against women in politics. And according to Professor Kruk and Restrepo Sanin, her co-authors, violence against women in politics actually refers to behaviors that specifically target women to leave politics by pressuring them to step down as candidates or resign a particular political office. And as a form of gender-based violence, I think acts of violence against women in politics take also many forms, including physical, sexual, and psychological violence, which will likely, I think, to happen in social medias right now. Yeah. And violence against women in politics also has become a policy issue in many countries, mainly in Latin America in the early 20s. You know that some countries such as Bolivia, Argentina, El Salvador have reformed their legislation on violence against women and passed specific bills on violence against women in politics. And we know that the United Nations also first recognized violence against women in politics as a problem in 2011, calling for zero tolerance for violence against female candidates and elected officials. I think given the extensive scholarly works and policy areas on violence against women, we can see that there has been probably, and I think I agree that there have been like a global consensus that violence against women in politics is serious threat to democracy, human rights, and gender equality. And we cannot simply see violence against women in politics as a normal cause of doing politics. That's the arguments of Professor Cook and many, scholars on this issue. And I think this issue also very relevant to Indonesia as we're heading to the next general election in 2024. Indonesia, as the world third largest democracy, will hold the most, I think, the most complex general elections, and probably will be the biggest democratic events in the world. And different from previous election in 2019, the next election will not only elect the president and vice president, and also the member of House of Representative at the national and local levels, and also the regional representative council, but also the regional head election simultaneously. So I think while we expect that women to be actively involved in the next political contestation, we also need to be aware of the potential for a gender-based violence among women in politics. Therefore, I think it is my sincere hope that at the end of today's talk, we will have develop a deep awareness, interest, and understanding on the experiences, problems, and challenges of violence against women in politics, particularly in the case of Indonesia, so we could anticipate and maybe prevent this kind of violence to occur during our next election. Finally, again, allow me to reconvey my appreciation to Professor Crook for sharing your insight, and also to IVIS for the support, Pak Anas and other fellows. Looking forward to our next collaboration. I would like also to express my gratitude to Dr. Kurniawati Hastuti Dewi, who will moderate this discussion, and also her team for preparing and organizing this important talk. I think that's all for me. Have a fruitful and insightful discussion. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much, Dr. Atika, for the wonderful opening remarks. And as have been mentioned by the Dr. Atika, today's event cannot be realized without the great collaboration between the Research Center for Politics BRIN and the IVIS. We are pleased to have the Executive Director of IVIS, Dr. Megan Hewitt, joining with us today. And for the next agenda, I would like to invite Dr. Hewitt to give a short introduction about the American Institute for Indonesian Studies. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Hewitt, who has conducted various research and fieldworks in Indonesia, including the projects on Indonesian literature, performance art, community-based education, and social movements. She also has recently completed her doctoral degree from the Department of South and Southeast Asian Studies at the University of California. And she is a two-time Fulbright Award recipient for research and teaching in Indonesia. Good evening, Dr. Megan Hewitt. The time is yours.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Nofos, and for everyone for organizing this. Thank you also to Dr. Atika for your introductory remarks, especially in framing this event in relation to relevant issues facing women in Indonesia, as well as the wider global discourse of violence against women in politics. And I think framing this in relation especially to the upcoming Indonesian presidential elections is really just a spot on. It's really going to be a time for us to see firsthand the role of women, and I'm just very excited about the kinds of collaborative research opportunities that might come about as a result of this conversation that we're helping to facilitate today. So it's my pleasure to provide some just short introductory remarks from APHIS. We are the American Institute for Indonesian Studies. For those who are not already familiar with APHIS, we are a nonprofit organization based in the US and in Indonesia. We are represented by a consortium of universities, colleges, and research centers in the US dedicated to advancing research exchange between the US and Indonesia. And also we collaborate quite extensively with a wide network of affiliated institutions in Indonesia, including BRIN. So Thank you for continuing those collaborations with us today. I was wanting to share before our event some information about upcoming opportunities that might be outlets for the continuation of this dialogue around themes of gender and women's studies and politics globally. And I want to tell you about two specific programs that you might see in this next year. The first is our academic writing workshop. This is something we present annually, and it is a workshop designed for Indonesian scholars working to publish internationally who already have a manuscript written, or at least a manuscript in progress. Elements of the workshop we present in a public forum, but 16 Indonesian scholars are selected and paired with consortium members from APHIS who have similar disciplinary or thematic research interests. And we found this just to be such a productive site for continuing research dialogue across a wide variety of disciplines. So we welcome Indonesian scholars applications. Look out for those applications in early 2023. The second thing I'd like to share with you today is our summer conference on Indonesian studies. This we organized in collaboration with the Asian Studies Center at Michigan State University, but is an entirely virtual conference that brings together upwards of 500 participants with near equal representation of junior and senior scholars, Indonesian and American scholars, and it's just becoming a very exciting space for research dialogue. So I welcome panels, roundtables, and individual papers on the themes discussed here. Perhaps, reach out to us. Perhaps we can help organize and pull together interested people who might like to continue some of these conversations together. Over the last couple of years, we have been seeing more themes of gender and women's studies from our wider community being presented at the conference. In 2022, just this past summer, we assembled a panel specifically to address issues of sexual violence on campuses in Indonesia, which was a very productive panel. In fact, I am going to drop this one in the chat because we just brought together such a wonderful group of scholar activists in that conversation. Also in 2021, in our first conference, we heard from keynote speaker, feminist scholar from Universitas Padjadjaran, Professor Akwarini Priyatna, who is just a preeminent feminist scholar in gender, cultural studies, and literary history. So these are just a sample of the things that we have been trying to support, and themes of gender and women's studies that have come up in our programs just over the past year. But finally, I want to just say that we are eager to develop new programs, new collaborations, make these kinds of academic research linkages that sustain future collaborations. So please reach out to us if you have ideas for developing any kind of program. And just finally, on behalf of APHIS, I want to say thank you again. At APHIS, one of our central goals is to facilitate greater dialogue between Indonesian and American scholars. And so we are really thrilled to continue our collaborations with the Research Center for Politics at BRIN. And thank you, Dr. Crook, for sharing your work with us today. I sincerely hope this will be a productive starting point for you as well to engage in future conversations with our Indonesian colleagues. So thank you all, and I'm really eager and excited to hear your talk today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hewitt. And ladies and gentlemen, before we move to our main agenda, may I invite the speaker and all participants to please turn your camera on because we will have a photo session. The committee will help to capture the screen, and we have three. We have three screens now, and let's start with the first page of the screen. I will count 1, 2, 3, and Mas Imam, please help me to capture. We'll wait. Some of you haven't opened your camera. Okay. Let's start. 1, 2, 3. And for the second page, 1, 2, 3. And the last, 1, 2, 3. Okay. Thank you very much. And now we have to come to our main agenda, the public lecture by Professor Monalina Kruk that will be guided by our lovely moderator today, Dr. Kurniawati Hastuti Dewi. Allow me to read her short bio. Dr. Kurniawati Hastuti Dewi is a senior researcher at the Research Center for Politics. Her research interests are in gender and politics, women and politics, gender and Islam, local politics, and civil society. She is the founder and the coordinator of the Gender and Politics Research Team at BRIN since 2015, and she received her doctoral degree in Asian Studies from the Graduate School of Asian and African Area Studies, Kyoto University, Japan in 2012. She has been actively building networks with the international feminists and scholars and was appointed as a Secretary General of the ASEAN Association of Women's Studies in the 2020 to the 2020. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our moderator, Dr. Kurniawati Hastuti Dewi. Mbak Nia, please, the screen is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Nufus, for very introductions. Good morning, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, couples of Research Center of Politics and Executive Director of IVIS, Ibu Megan Hawit, PhD, and good night for Professor Kruk in the USA time. So we are very grateful to have you today and excited to welcome you all at the public talk, Violence Against Women in Politics, a rising threat to democracy worldwide. So why violence against women? Why this is so important? Because we are in Indonesia, so I would like to draw our attention on the empirical data related to violence against women. According to Komnas Perempuan or Indonesian National Commission on Violence Against Women, a total of 338,496 cases of gender-based violence against women was recorded in 2022. This figure illustrates a significant 50% increase in cases of gender-based violence compared to 2021. So how about in the larger picture? So actually we are not alone because United Nations have launched the UN commemoration of the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women on 23rd November 2022 at the United Nations quarters in New York. So it's just like a couple of days ago. So part of this movement is the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence campaign around the world, which runs from 25 November to 10 December 2022. So actually today's webinar is a part of this global campaign to end violence against women worldwide. And ladies and gentlemen, actually the concern on the violence against women worldwide currently surrounding by the global trend of decline of democratic, or some scholars in Indonesia have tried to explain the democratic regression in Indonesian phenomenon. So in order to discuss these two important development or trend, we are very grateful and honored to have Professor Kruk today with us. So for those who haven't familiar with Professor Kruk, I have prepared this short PowerPoint to explain her CV. So Professor Monalina Kruk is Professor of Political Science, Chair of the Women in Politics PhD program at Rutgers University. She has published widely on gender and political representation, particularly on electoral gender quotas and the impact of women in public office, including the award-winning Quotas for Women in Politics, Gender and Candidate Selection Reform Worldwide, published by Oxford University Press in 2009. She is currently the lead editor of Politics and Gender, the official journal of the Women, Gender, and Politics section of the American Political Science Association. Her most recent book, Violence Against Women in Politics, published by Oxford University in 2020, was researched with the support of National Science Foundation Career Award and an Andrew Carnegie Fellowship. Written for scholars and practitioners, it won the 2022 Grammar Award for Ideas Improving World Order, given to those who have taken up issues of world importance and presented viewpoints that could lead to a more just and peaceful world. Since 2015, Crook has collaborated with the National Democratic Institute, or NDI, on the hashtag Not the Cost campaign to stop violence against women in politics, which over the last 5 years has informed NDI's global programming, contributed to the debate at the United Nations, and inspired effort in the US Congress to address this problem. So Prof. Crook has published many books, but I already spotted these 3 important books for those who are familiar with gender, women, and politics and quota. So the first one is Quotas for Women in Politics, published in 2009, and then Women, Gender, and Politics, published in 2010, and Violence Against Women in Politics, published in 2020. So we are very honored to have Professor Crook today to explore her thoughts about the current issue on violence against women. So our speaker will present at 45 minutes, and then we will have 45 minutes for Q&A sessions. Please follow the instruction for the general rule of the Q&A session as explained in the chat box. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me to welcoming Professor Crook today. Professor Crook, the time is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen as well. And let's see here. So you can see my screen? Yes, and you can hear me too. Okay. Let me just start by thanking you very much for the invitation to be with you virtually. I did have a chance to go to Indonesia about 9 years ago to talk about gender quotas. So it's nice to talk about my second big topic on violence against women in politics with you in Indonesia as well. I was also really pleased that there's a mention of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. There's a campaign that actually started here at Rutgers University in the early 1990s, and it connects the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women on November 25th with International Human Rights Day on December 10th. So the idea that women's rights are human rights, violence against women has really been a huge part of making the case for thinking about women's rights as human rights. And so it's nice to sort of also think about the global reach of this campaign as well. So I'm going to talk about my book on violence against women in politics, and some of the bigger themes that come out of the research that I did for that work. And so so this is just the cover of my book, and I just to let you know I have a Twitter account that's also connected to the book called VAW Politics. So that's just up here on the first screen. So just to give you some background or inspiration for this work, this project came out of the work that I did earlier on gender quotas. And so these are policies, as you know, obviously you have one in Indonesia, but they've also been adopted in more than 140 other countries around the world. And most of these policies have been adopted since the 1990s, especially after 1995. So my first book was really interested in the question of how these measures spread around the world, right? How do they diffuse and get adopted in so many very different contexts? And as part of that project, I was also really interested in variations in their effects, right? So some quotas are more successful than others in increasing the share of women elected. So those are sort of the questions I was asking in that project. That inspired a second project on the impact of quotas beyond numbers, which was interested in questions like, what kinds of women are elected through quotas, right? What impact they have on policy making.
Professor Crook, you are muted your mic.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes.
It was like I got a notification, sorry. Yes, so I was saying my second project was about the impact of quota. So thinking about their broader effects, in particular on women, on society, on democracy. So I was doing some field work for this project in 9 countries across Western Europe, Latin America, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And one of the things I really expected to hear were sort of positive stories of transformation, right? So greater acceptance of women as leaders. And in the course of the interviews that I was doing, I did hear some of those positive stories, but I also heard accounts of resistance and backlash, often taking the forms of violence, harassment, and intimidation. So around the same time, a number of practitioner organizations started to observe the same thing, right? So these are organizations that were on the ground working on questions of women's political participation. So UN Women, Interparliamentary Union, the Inter-American Commission of Women, for example. In 2015, I connected with colleagues in the National Democratic Institute Gender, Women, and Democracy team. And we decided to try to bring people together, right, to bring global attention to this issue. So in 2016, we launched the Not the Cost campaign to stop violence against women in politics with a speech from NDI Chair Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State, as well as testimonies from political women around the world. And the hashtag Not the Cost was really just trying to make the case that violence should not be the cost of women's political participation, right? Something that we accept as just being a woman in public life, right? You're going to experience violence. We say, well, why should we just accept that, right? We should be able to change politics, and women should be able to participate in the same terms that men are able to participate. So that's why we call it the Not the Cost campaign. So at this time, it's mainly practitioners who are talking about this, international NGOs, and there wasn't really an academic voice in that debate. So I wrote my book to try to bring an academic perspective to these sort of emerging global discussions. And so it's written really not just for academics or students, but also for politicians, for democracy assistance organizations, right? Many different audiences. So I have 4 questions that I try to look at in the book. So the first is really, where did this concept of violence against women in politics come from? Like, where do we get the word? How do we define what it is? Second, how is it different from other forms of violence in politics? So a lot of people say that, politics is just a violent space. So maybe it's not surprising that as you have growing numbers of women entering those spaces, they also experience violence. The third question is, what does violence against women in politics look like, right? So what are the different forms it takes around the world? And then finally, what can be done to address it? And why does it matter that we do, right? Why do we need to pay attention to this question? And that's really what I want to talk about, its impact on democracy, on human rights, and on gender equality. So I'll give you answers very briefly to all 4 of these questions. But before I sort of jump into that, I think it's important to probably clarify what I mean by the key terms violence and then women in politics. So for many people, violence refers to the use of physical force. I think that's sort of a common everyday understanding of what violence is. And so some scholars talk about this as a minimalist definition of violence, which privileges the perspective of the perpetrator, right, and focuses on an act that takes place at a discrete moment in time, right? So there's a clearly identifiable beginning and end. In contrast, more comprehensive definitions understand violence a little bit differently. So they understand it not in terms of the use of force, but they define it as a violation, and specifically as a violation of integrity in the sense of the wholeness or the intactness of the self. So from this perspective, a person's physical integrity can be violated, right? But also their mental or emotional integrity as well. This approach shifts the focus to the targets and their experiences of violence. And it points out that violent acts can have ripple effects that affect the target as well as, members of their families, their communities for years to come, right? Doesn't stop and start, right? It's a lingering experience that has long enduring effects. So this second comprehensive definition of violence is very much in line with how women's rights activists think about violence against women or gender-based violence, which they argue exists along a continuum or a spectrum, right? Where different kinds of acts tap into the same phenomenon, but also interact with and bolster one another. So the classic example is, an iceberg where those visible physical acts are really just the tip, right? There's a whole range of other acts like gendered insults or sexual harassment that form this mass underneath the surface, right? They're much more common, and it really, they're working together, right, to repress women. Okay, so it's a very broad definition of violence, and that will sort of set the context for when I talk about different forms of violence. In terms of the concept of women in politics, so my early work, for example, with Juliana Restrepo-Sanin, focused exclusively on women politicians, but my book really tries to argue that this is a question of women's political participation more broadly. Right, so we should think about women serving in a wide range of political roles, right? So any way that you can participate in politics. So we see this happening at the UN level, for example. So there have been separate campaigns on violence against female politicians, violence against women human rights defenders, and violence against women journalists. So what you see here in this resolution adopted in 2018, they talk about acts of violence against women and girls involved in political and public life, including women in leadership, journalists, and human rights defenders, right? So they're thinking about this as a form of violence that affects women in different political roles. But my definition would also include, women as voters, women as party members, election officials. In the United States, it's, election officials are very much targeted. You could also think about staffers and interns, just volunteers, right? People who work on political campaigns, they could also potentially experience violence. Okay, so again, a broad definition of women in politics as well in my approach. Okay, so then if I go to those questions, right? So the first is really where did this concept come from? I think for a very long time, it was like many of women's experiences, a problem with no name. So that's a very famous phrase from Betty Friedan, who was an American feminist in the 1960s. She talked about the problem with no name and the fact that women's experiences often lack a name, right? So it's hard to talk about their experiences. So we see this happening with the issue of violence against women in politics, that women around the world started to try to give a name to this experience. So this is really a very short period of time between about 2000, 2010, in different parts of the global South. So in Bolivia, locally elected women started to talk about their experience as political harassment and violence against women. Then there was a network of elected women in South Asia that were talking about violence against women in politics. And then there were women in Kenya. There was a very big problem with electoral violence, the 2007 elections, both during the campaign and then afterwards. And there, women started to talk about electoral gender-based violence, right? So they use slightly different terms, right? But they're really trying to capture something similar, right? A form of violence that targeted women in politics because they were women, right? And it was specifically about stopping women from participating in politics, making them less effective, and just sort of to keep them out of political spaces. Around 2010, a number of international organizations, like the ones I mentioned before, people working on democracy and electoral assistance, they started to connect these debates, right? Because they're working in different regions of of the world. And they pointed out this wasn't just like a problem in Bolivia, right? This is a problem affecting women in different places. And in this initial focus, it was really about this is a problem mainly affecting women in the global South. But over the last 10 years, we've seen women across the global North also start to speak up increasingly about this issue, right? Some countries like Australia, if you think about Julia Gillard's very famous misogyny speech in 2012, you have Italy, you have some women who, pictures here, Laura Boldrini was the president of the Italian Chamber of Deputies, the lower house of parliament. She started to talk about it. Cecile Kyenge, the woman on the top right, she's the first Black cabinet minister in Italy, faced a lot of racist and sexist attacks in her political role. And then you have, cases like France, the UK with the assassination of Joe Cox, who was a member of parliament in 2016 around the time of the Brexit referendum. And then the United States, of course, with the 2016 campaign, which was just full of like sexism and misogyny and violence. And then in 2017, there's the Me Too movement, right, which highlighted that violence and harassment was a problem in politics as it was a problem in other spaces as well, right? And so I think much like the broader concept of violence against women, right? I think these were debates that really showed that this was a problem that affected women in all countries, right? All different kinds of backgrounds, political context. It might take slightly different forms, right? But it was the same sort of rough, like underlying problem. But, despite the fact that we see more people talking, speaking up about it, this is still an issue that I think is still emerging, right? It hasn't quite got the full consensus or understanding about it. I think there's a few reasons why to recognize, thinking about barriers, right? So in my research, I found that a few different kinds of barriers. So the first is a cognitive one, right? So this is that women just normalize the violence against them, right? And they think about it as an individual problem. They don't see it as a structural issue. And so they just don't see it. They don't see the violence. Another type of gap is political, right? So women do see they see the problem, they see the violence, but they don't want to speak out because they think it will make them appear weak, right? As this is just why women don't belong in politics, because they can't handle the violence. Or they think it could be weaponized by their political rivals, right? To sort of suggest that they're not competent. A different barrier is what I call a receptivity gap, right? So women do speak out, but then they're not believed, right? Or they're accused of playing the gender card. Like that this is just, they're just making it up, right? This isn't actually a problem. And then the last one has to do with resources, right? So women do want to speak out, but they don't have any place to go. They don't have any language to describe their experiences, right? So the work that I'm doing in my book and in the work I do with practitioners, we try to break down some of these barriers, right? And I've been to so many panels, right, where like political women they say, this is the first time I've ever talked about this in public, right? Or women get up and they say, I find my story in your story, right? And there's like a lot of the like connections are being made in these discussions. And so I'm really just always happy to talk about it because I think it's like, let's give people a language, right, where they can see it and they can describe what their issues are and say it's not normal, right? And it's women do experience this. We should believe women when they tell us this is happening. So one of the ways that I try to do that is through the theoretical framework, which gets to that second question about how's it different from other forms of violence in politics. So this is let's say a summary of what I think is a difference between ordinary violence in politics and violence against women in politics. So violence in politics is how I think political violence has traditionally been understood, right? So people see it as being directed at your political opponents. So in a sense, it's issue-based, right? It's about implementing your political program over the other side's political program. So this is a type of violence that can affect both men and women, right? It's more common in contexts where there might be greater impunity for violence, right? So in a post-conflict context, for example, like people have weapons, people are able to, there's not a strong state there able to protect people who are targeted, right? This is a form of violence that can take some gendered forms. So for example, there are some countries where sexual violence gets used against female supporters of another party. So this happened in Kenya, this happened in places like Zimbabwe, right? It's politically motivated rape, right? But the nature of this this violence is because it's the other side, right? You don't agree with them politically. And if we look at the academic work, we look at how international organizations, governments have thought about this type of violence, they recognize it's a problem for democracy because one side is sort of getting its way or trying to get its way through force and intimidation, right? Rather than through rational debate or fair and free elections. So people can say that this is a problem for democracy. Violence against women in politics is different in a number of important ways. So rather than being issue-based or program-based, it's identity-based, right? It specifically targets women, driven by the patriarchal idea that politics is a male space, right? So therefore, women have to be kept out of this space. It can take some gendered forms, right? It can take forms like sexual violence, but it can also involve things just like assassinations, right? Things that men maybe also experience these sort of forms of violence, but the motivation is different. And I want to argue that the democratic costs of this form of violence aren't yet widely recognized. And I think this is for a few reasons. One is that just violence against women is highly normalized in many societies, right? So they just don't seem like it's out of the ordinary, right? We accept it because, of course, that's just the price of being a woman, right? That you feel insecure online or, out in public spaces, right? So there's that tendency to normalize it. So that's why we don't see it. The second reason is that there's a tendency to equate acts of violence against women in politics with these traditional forms of violence in politics, to say that, oh, it's just the same thing, right? Overlooking the second type of motivation, right? So you end up sort of framing them as if they're politically motivated rather than identity motivated. And finally, I think most politically active women experience both forms of violence, right? Sometimes in the exact same act, right? Sometimes at different moments in time, right? So sometimes it gets hard to disentangle what of this is issue-based and what is identity-based, right? But they're kind of mixed together. But I still think it's important, even if it's kind of hard to disentangle them in some cases, to try to recognize these two dimensions, right? And this is because violence against women in politics poses a distinct challenge to democracy and human rights, right? It's about who can participate in politics, right? It's not just about the ideas and the programs we want to implement, but really about who has the right to be at the table at all. So if I just give you some examples, some data from a UN Women's study, it illustrates this distinction, I think, very well, or gives some evidence for this distinction. So this is a figure from a UN Women's study of violence against politically active women in India, Pakistan, and Nepal. So women were asked in a survey who is most likely to perpetrate acts of violence against women in politics, or they're just thinking, they're kind of mixing up the different forms that I've just separated. But when they experience violence, who's doing it? So you can see that in India, a large number of people said the other contestant, right? The other side. But if you look across, so people could answer multiple things. This is why it doesn't add up to 100%, the multiple perpetrators. If you look at across the three countries, who are the most common perpetrators, it's members of women's own political party, followed by members of their own family, right? And this is a surprising finding if we only think about political violence as being issue-based, right? But it's not surprising if we think about the insights of work on gender-based violence, right? So women are more likely to experience violence at the hands of people they know, right? And also, this just doesn't make sense. Why would you attack a member of your own political party, right? If it was about like implementing a political program, right? So it really shows that this is a different dimension that's not captured by existing definitions. Talking about violence against women in politics, of course, doesn't necessarily mean that gender is the only salient identity, right? So in my interviews and in the emerging research in this area, we see, for example, that younger women and women of color, so ethnic minority women, seem to face even higher levels of abuse. So on the left was some data from European parliaments, and they separated out like interviewees under the age of 40 and over. And every type of act, younger women faced higher levels of violence or more likely to experience it. On the right is some data from an Amnesty International study of women in the British Parliament, and it showed that women with Asian and Black backgrounds were much more likely, like disproportionately more likely to experience violence, right? In comparison to their proportion of politicians overall. I don't think this is surprising though, if we sort of take that violence against women in politics framework on board, right? Because it suggests that women are attacked because they're not seen as rightful participants in political spaces. And I think this is an insight that would also hold or should hold for people who challenge the status quo in other ways, right? So people who don't look like the typical older, in the US case, white, male politician, right? They don't look like the image we have in our mind of a politician, right? So that's why I think it's not surprising that we see like ethnic minority women, right? They're challenged in these sort of racist ways as well as these sexist ways together at the same time. And if they're young women, there's an ageist way as well, right? So just all this is just to say is that I really want to think about it as like an identity-based form of violence. It's not just any type of violence that women experience, but it's a gender-based form of violence against women who want to be active in politics. Okay, so third question, what does it look like in practice? So most practitioners focus on 4 types of violence. You can see this is the Interparliamentary Union's first report from 2016 on sexism, harassment, and violence against women parliamentarians. And the survey asked them if they had personally experienced any of these forms of violence, like connected to their work in parliament. So not just like as a woman in society, but as a parliamentarian. And then also if they'd seen it happen to other women. So they asked about these 4 types of violence, which are recognized in international treaties and national legislation. So you can see that it's not just physical violence. And I think the findings are really interesting, right? So if we only looked at physical violence, I mean, it's still a very high proportion. About 25% of women in the study said that they had experienced physical violence in the course of their work as parliamentarians. But more than 80% said they had experienced some form of psychological violence. And about a third said they had experienced economic violence. Around 20% said they'd experienced sexual violence, right? So if we only look at those physical forms, right, we're really missing out on this whole wide range of forms of violence, harassment, intimidation that women are experiencing in public life. And actually, you can see that like something like psychological abuse, we overlook that. I mean, that is like the vast majority of women in the study said they experienced it, right? So clearly it's a problem we want to discuss. So this data was from the global study. They subsequently have done a study of women in European parliaments and women in African parliaments. And the pattern is roughly the same. It might be like a little bit higher or lower in terms of, say, physical or economic violence, but psychological violence is always over 80%, right? So most women experience it, and that holds across many different political contexts. I do think, though, that what is very interesting about the question of asking about, have you seen other women experience it? usually you do that when people don't want to admit like they experience something that might be stigmatized, or they don't want to like be attributed an attitude like that they're sexist or racist, right? So you ask them what they think, but then you ask them what their neighbor thinks, right? As a way of maybe what they say their neighbor thinks maybe is what really happened to them or what they really think. And in the psychological, physical, and economic violence, it's roughly the same, right? So it's pretty similar. I think women are disclosing as much as they are seeing. But sexual violence is interesting, right? So about 22% women said they personally experienced it, but 33% said that they know other women who experienced it. So this is right before the Me Too movement. I think that has changed things a little bit, but it's interesting, right? It's still hard to talk about sexual violence in general, and it's harder to talk about that in this context. It seems to be suggested in this data. Yes, okay. Sorry, I just lost my place here. Okay, yeah. So in my book, I give some examples of all these 4 types, but then I add a 5th type that I think is not captured in these existing typologies. And in all the cases I look at, I try to include cases from like the global North and the global South equally, really to highlight that this isn't a unique problem, right, to different parts of the world, but something that we can see in all different kinds of contexts. So just to give you a couple of examples. So I think about physical violence, of course, like murders, kidnappings, beatings, right, even arbitrary detention, right, jailing women human rights defenders, for example, could be a form of physical violence. And here's an example just from Bolivia, which is a local counselor. You can see she's an indigenous woman who she had experienced all these other forms of violence, and she just didn't give up or leave politics. So in the end, she was murdered. And it was like the catalyst that led to the passage of the first law in the world to criminalize political harassment and violence against women in Bolivia. So just an example of that. Psychological violence would include like death threats, rape threats, intimidation, stalking. Probably the most common form is online harassment, so social media abuse in particular. And that is like a very common area of research now. Like I keep track of all the new work, and a lot of it is on the social media abuse, right? Trying to track it and think about how it affects women. And sexual violence, it actually includes rape or sexual harassment, sexualized threats. And I think, as I said, I think it's very difficult traditionally for women to speak up about it, but I think the Me Too movement's been really important, at least, in the US, for example, for women to start talking up about it, more so in the last few years. Economic violence might not be as familiar a concept to you, but it is introduced it's in many national laws, and it's also in the Istanbul Convention, which is like the most recent, big global convention on violence against women. And so it refers to using access to economic resources as a form of intimidation or coercion, right? So in this context, it can include things like destroying women's campaign materials, vandalizing their offices and their homes, trying to ruin their livelihoods, like burning down their crops, basically doing a whole range of things that make it difficult or even impossible for women to continue their political work. So the example I have here is from the Iraq election in 2018, where there was massive, people were destroying women's campaign materials to the point that the UN special representative got together all the political parties to say, you need to stop destroying women's campaign materials. And so you can just see this example here. There were other really horrible things that happened, but that was one of the tactics used by opponents of women's participation. So in addition to these 4 types, I introduce a 5th type that I call semiotic violence. And I don't think it's captured by those existing typologies. So I define it as using words and images to try to degrade and delegitimize women as political leaders, political participants. And so it includes things like, Photoshopped images depicting women in, sexually graphic or humiliating ways. Maybe photos of women without headscarves in mosques, right, to suggest that they're immoral, right? But it's actually not true, right? You have false sex tapes. This is become very common in many different places in the world. And even deep fake videos, right? So using digital manipulation to present women as if they're saying and doing things that they actually aren't doing, really portraying women in these sort of fake, false sorts of ways. And I think that semiotic violence is something that has characterized portrayals of women in public life since time immemorial, but it has really become a crucial part of gender disinformation campaigns, right? So just fake news about women in politics usually takes these semiotic forms. And it's not, people don't send these images, right, to the women in question. Sometimes they do, right? And that would be psychological violence. But it's really about public consumption, right? It's spreading these memes around on social media, right? And sort of shifting how people think about these women in public life. Okay, so then given the problem, what can we do, right? It's a pretty depressing problem, but I do feel invigorated by the fact that people talk about it and are trying to find some solutions. So in my book, I talk about solutions that emerged those individual facets of violence, but then also some that sort of cut across multiple forms of violence at the same time. So just to give you a few examples, I think the starting point for really any strategy is awareness raising. So this is about making it a problem with a name, right? Telling people about this problem and naming it. And, I think this is something that everyone can do, right? Just average people in conversations, with people. But here are just some examples. Of course, the Not the Cost campaign, that's exactly what we're trying to do. But you also have, collective letters, you have individual testimonies by female politicians. So example here, I have a public letter put out by political women in California to talk about sexual harassment, talks by Flora, who is a candidate in Kenyan elections, and Sarah Hanson-Young is a woman senator in Australia, and so she wrote a whole book about her experiences with violence and harassment in the Senate. In the US, I just was really interested to sort of be a part of a couple of initiatives in the US Congress. So this is in 2020, there was a House resolution introduced. It was in 2021, a second House resolution was introduced, and it was put forward by Representative Rashida Tlaib, who is one of the first two Muslim women elected to the U.S. Congress, together with Ilhan Omar, as well as with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ayanna Pressley. They're known as the Squad, right? So they're young women of color in American politics. There's the four members of the Squad, and it's Jackie Speer, who is a longtime feminist, a Democratic congresswoman from California. And she actually put forward the Me Too Congress bill, which was about holding perpetrators to account for sexual harassment against women in the Congress, staffers, campaign volunteers in particular. So they tried to raise awareness. So in their resolution, they talked about violence against women in politics as a global problem, including in the United States, right? So it's really about trying to let people know about this broadly, but to say, it's also a problem in our own country as well. Okay, so I think that's sort of overarching strategy, right? So then I just give you a few examples for the different types of violence. So in terms of physical violence, we've seen some efforts in countries like Nigeria and Afghanistan to develop virtual campaign tools, right, that help women reach voters without exposing them to the security threats. In the UK, Parliament set up a new security office in Parliament after the murder of Jo Cox, right? So she was a young woman member of Parliament in 2016. And what's interesting is that they set it up. I talked to the police officer who was in charge of this office, and he said, it's not meant specifically for women, but women use it disproportionately. Like if women are 30% of parliament, they're like 60 or 70% of the people who have facing these complaints, right? As well as, Jewish women and Black women and young women, right? There is definitely an intersectional component there as well. Psychological violence, just an example of something to do. The example I have here is a Canadian NGO, which created a bot, an automated posting account on Twitter that was trained to detect abuse during elections against abuse towards women candidates. And it would respond by having positive and encouraging tweets, so that it wasn't just all negativity in a woman's feed, right? But that there was some sort of encouragement and support offered to them. So I think that was an interesting way to think about how to deal with psychological abuse. There's also politicians like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who actually just speaks out against the abusive messages, right? She posts them, she comments on them as a way of saying this isn't normal, right? We shouldn't accept these kinds of messages. In terms of sexual violence, I think one of the most important strategies has been to try to collect women's testimonies, right? To say we just want to hear your voices and your experiences, as well as trying then in turn to connect them to resources, right? Support, as well as inform public policy. So here's just an example on the left from the British Labour Party, women who collected women's experiences in the party with sexual harassment. I've also seen initiatives in countries like Canada, as well as in the European Parliament, which is here, to create pledges and codes of conduct to sort of denormalize the abuse, right? This is just not normal, and I pledge not to commit it. I pledge to call it out if I see other people do it. I think that's been very important for trying to tackle this issue of sexual violence, make it something that's not stigmatizing, right? Something that's embarrassing, but something that we need to talk about because it's a serious problem. In terms of economic violence, I think most of these examples that I had found were really about trying to provide women with some monetary resources. This is especially true of human rights defenders that might need to travel or, get security very quickly. So thinking about that in terms of grants, right, to provide women with those resources. And in terms of semiotic violence, I think this is the hardest to think about what to do. So some examples of women trying to combat that is simply to use existing laws, right? If it's illegal to, use hate speech or to issue violent threats, right? If that is the nature of the semiotic violence, sometimes existing laws, legal frameworks can be helpful. We also see efforts to kind of rethink the language of politics, right? So the example I have on the right is from Argentina, which is a guide for non-sexist and egalitarian language. And it was just about trying to denormalize sort of sexism and misogyny in language, right? So these are just ways of trying to deal with, to make politics more inclusive of women, right? And other marginalized groups. But this is, I think, an area where there's a lot of potential for future intervention. And I think it's really important when we think about disinformation, right? How can we counteract that, right? Maybe it's telling people the real information. I'm not sure. But I think there's a lot we could think about here. And just very briefly, some cross-cutting solutions. We see efforts at the global and the national levels to create legislation. So, the UN, I think, has been very involved in sort of just creating some of the normative frameworks. People have used the CEDAW committee as a way of getting this issue on the agenda. For example, the recent ILO Convention on Violence and Harassment in the World of Work, it actually has lots of really interesting potential applications to the role of politics, thinking about politics as a workplace. I think that hasn't been developed as much, but that provides a framework. In Latin America, I mentioned the law in Bolivia, but it is actually, there's also a law in Mexico, and there are some revisions to like laws in Argentina, other places, to put this issue on the agenda. So the Inter-American Commission of Women created a model law that's using all those experiences to support legislative reform efforts across the region. But that's really the main place where people have looked at the sort of legal strategies. But there's also in Tunisia, when they passed their violence against women law, they included political violence in there. And also like Catalonia also has a law on violence against women in politics. But those are sort of exceptions to what we is mainly in Latin America where we see this work. In terms of civil society efforts, I think a lot of this is about safety planning, supporting women's safety during campaigns. So in Kenya, the example on the right, they created, this is a Federation of Women Lawyers. They created like a text messaging system where people could be, report crimes against women voters, women candidates, but then if it was candidates or voters themselves, they could be connected to legal representation, counseling, right, hospital services, and things like that. So really trying to think about women's security and safety in a sort of holistic sort of way. Okay, so finally, why does it matter? Why does it matter that we recognize and address violence against women in politics? So in the book, I argue that violence against women in politics doesn't just affect the individual targets. I mean, we should care that it affects the individual targets, but it also affects political institutions and society at large, right? So we all have a personal interest in dealing with this issue. So I think there are at least three effects on democracy. Violence against women in politics undermines the exercise of women's political rights, right? From their right to vote, to the right to run for and hold political office, to the right to free expression, right? So it is fundamentally about undermining the political rights that they hold that are guaranteed in constitutions and laws and international law as well. But it also tries to interrupt women's political work, right? It draws time and attention away from their political priorities, right? So a lot of women say that they self-censor. They don't speak up about controversial topics because they know it will attract abuse, right? So that like takes things out of public discourse, right? You're not talking about important topics. And I think that harms all of us. And finally, I think that it negatively affects citizens' trust in politicians and the political process more generally, right? Because it's about undercutting civility and mutual respect of political opponents as a value in democratic politics. And I'm not just thinking about opponents in the other party, I'm thinking about opponents in your own party as well, right? It sort of just makes politics like a not attractive place, right, for anybody to be, or something that can contribute positively to society. Violence against women in politics also infringes on women's human rights. And this is because, going back to the definition of violence, it seeks to attack women's personal dignity and integrity, right? And it's about trying to undermine their feelings of self-worth. And so there was one Kenyan politician who wrote that her attackers had wanted to humiliate me, strip me of all my dignity, and leave of me but a shell, right? And so it really gets to the core of who you are. It also, affects your sense of security, right? It stops women's freedom of movement, and it cultivates a sense of like constant self-awareness, right? That, psychologists have shown stops people from pursuing social justice because they think that it's just an added burden of activism, right? So you just rather not do that activism, right? Because of the potential cost to yourself, right? So again, that like stops us from moving ahead, right, in these productive, important ways. And lastly, I think it's important to recognize that violence against women in politics affects gender equality. Violence against women is widely recognized as a form of discrimination, right? That's how it's defined in most laws. It's a form of discrimination against women. And in politics, I think it has both individual and group effects, right? So in many places around the world, it's caused politically active women to leave politics, or at least to modify their behaviors, right? So this collectively reduces the impact of the voices, their voices and their participation, right, in these political debates. And I think that their mistreatment also serves as a warning to other women, right, to not to follow their lead, right, or even to express support for women in public life. In the United States, an example of that is like supporters of Hillary Clinton were massively like trolled online, right, and threatened just because they said they supported Hillary Clinton, right? So it's not just like the candidate again, but it's also about women's participation in the political system. But really, I would say the biggest group effect that people have been discussing is how violence might affect the political ambitions of young women, right? So it doesn't just affect the current moment of women in politics, the present of women in politics, but it's also about the future, right? And so if you take these women, young women out of the system at the beginning, right, they never get a chance to have their voices heard or to participate. And I think this becomes really important when we think about political staffers, campaign volunteers, right? You don't want young women's last contact with politics to be like sexual violence, right? It's something that I think is very important for the future of gender equality as well. Okay, so just to conclude, I think that naming the problem of violence against women in politics has important repercussions along, multiple dimensions. And it really shows us that, defending women's rights is integral to defending or protecting political and human rights more broadly. And though it is a very large and seemingly, intractable problem, I think the good news is that everyone can do something to address it. And I think the most important is to name the problem and to call it out, right, to raise awareness in the ways that I discussed. And, in my book, I really, want to emphasize that I'm not saying the final word on this topic at all, right? I think that, I want to start a conversation and, encourage, other people to write on this. And so in addition to my book, I created a couple of online resources that would sort of like capture these new developments. So I created a Twitter account, which tries to like share those news and share news items, new resources. But I also created a website called vawpolitics.org. And there's a research page that includes like full text links to all academic research and, practitioner research in this area. There's this report issued earlier today by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. I need to put those on there, but they created a series of toolkits. And so just trying to make it like very easy for people to get up to speed on the topic, and then to see what, all the new work that's coming out and maybe elaborating or challenging or extending, some of the things that I talk about in my book. So I just recommend, you check out those resources if you're, interested in the topic and, interested in, finding ways to be part of the solution as well. So thank you. I'll end there, and I guess we can open up to questions or discussion. Stop the share here.
Thank you so much, Professor Krug, for very comprehensive and thorough presentation. Professor Krug already explained to us her what we call academic career, in which initially she interested on the topic on gender and quota on women politics and parliament, and then she then moves to this important development on the concept of violence, and then she bring us on the attention to pay attention on the violence against women, especially in politics, rather than a general definition of violence against women, but she emphasized violence against women in politics. So, and then she said that this is an emerging concept, combating violence against women in politics, rising from 2000 since 2000 to around 2010, and especially targeted women in politics because they are women. And then once that I'm really an eye-opener note for me is that you give us 4 important notes on the barrier to recognition of violence against women in politics. The first is women normalize the violence. And the second said they see the violence, but they do not be brave to talk about it. And then women do speak up, but they do not have any language to express it. And the last one, no place and no language to go. And then for me, the term violence against women in politics is really important, and it is an eye-opener term for me, especially personally, and I hope there will be the same experience for other audience as well, because usually we only talk about violence against women, but you emphasize violence against women in politics, and then you give us a hint that this is actually an identity-based, specifically targeted women in politics, and then driven by patriarchal nuance that actually politics is mainly defined as a man words, and then you also mentioned that democratic cause is not recognized. So yeah, this kind of things that we usually actually saw it, but doesn't aware that this is violence against women in politics. So this is an eye-opener concept for me, and I'm sure as well for the audience. And then I also got surprised with the data about the violence against women in politics. You give us the graph that a majority of the violence against women in politics come from the members of some political party and religious group. So that's so amazing. How comes women's experience violence also come from the same college in the same political party? That's also I think there is problem in Indonesia. And also, you give us note as well that usually violence against women occur mostly among younger women, and then women of white and black as well. So if reflecting to the next election of Indonesia in 2024, we actually expecting more younger voters, around 37 younger voters will be participated in the elections. Meaning, if we reflecting in your notes, yeah, probably we have to be aware of this kind of violence against women among younger voters, or maybe younger female candidates in the election, in the upcoming election. So this is important consideration we have to think about our case in Indonesia. And then Prof. Kok also give us 4 important types of violence, from psychological, sexual, physical, economical, and she added 1 more types of semiotic violence. Very interesting, Prof. And then give us many examples as well. And then this is really important for us to reflecting to Indonesian cases about this semiotic violence. I think it will be related a lot. And then also amazed with the US Congress. Yeah, you give us an example on this 116 Congress, how the Congress recognized the violence against women in politics is one important problem, and then recognizing it is a part of global phenomenon, and try to supporting full and meaningful participation of women. So I think once we aware of this violence against women in politics, the next step is we have to be able to recognize by the law that actually this kind of problem in current day society, not only in the US, maybe in Indonesia as well. And then once we aware, then we recognize this problem. The next step is we have to do something to overcome the problem. And then there is also some implication on the violence against women and politics, undermining the democracy, violated human rights, and then it will affect gender quota, and especially Professor Group talk and with asking everyone to contribute on the work what we call movement to end or eradicate violence against women in politics, because everyone can contribute to this movement, and I agree with that. So it's really a thorough what we call presentation, Prof. Thank you so much, and I think many audience already have some questions. I already note in here. So let me read some of the question. One question is from Ibu Nur Aziza. Maybe Ibu Nur Aziza is in the Zoom room, yeah. It is very interesting topic, and then I think she gives us suggestion for the next discussion. Please also invite Indonesian female politician who can talk the experience. So Bu Nur Aziza, maybe you want to share your experience in this moment. Bu Nur Aziza.
Okay, thank you. I'm not a politician, but I'm not academician.
Okay. Yeah.
But it's very interesting topic, but I do not have data which come from Indonesia. But I'm sure that it's happened also in Afghanistan. So, Prof. Cook, would you like to give a suggestion how to make a negotiation with the Taliban regime, which delete or marginalize women from the public area? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Bunda Aziza. So Bunda Aziza is from International Relations Department, Universitas Muhammadiyah Yogyakarta, ya Bu. So I just read the name in the Zoom room. So Prof, you want to ask directly? You want to answer directly? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think the this is such a new topic that we're really only starting to like understand it, and so a lot of the events that I've been involved with have included the voices of women in politics or politically active women, and I think that's so important, right? Because we think about giving women a chance to give their testimonies, to share what experience they had. I actually have there's a chapter in the book on data collection and documentation, because I think it's really hard to show that a problem exists if you can't like point to some sort of data about it. And so there've been a number of groups that have done this who aren't just academics, right? So I just helped. There was the Forum of Women MPs in Kyrgyzstan. They wanted to support some data collection on violence against women in politics in their country. And so they connected with the OSCE, who connected with me, and they also connected with local researchers in the country. And it was just like, how do we collect this data? How do we understand what the problem is? And so I think there's very grassroots, but a lot of like collaboration to try to understand the issue. But it still is like a very, I think, stigmatized topic. It's very difficult for women to speak up about it. And I think that the women who do speak up are often very, very brave to do it, right? Because often talking about it attracts more abuse, and it just sort of becomes a potential sort of cycle of abuse. But yeah, I mean, I think that the case, like I mentioned, of Kyrgyzstan is where actually women in parliament are sort of helping to sort of create the momentum to study this question. I also think, the case of Tunisia is very interesting, that they, after the Arab Spring, they obviously got a new government, a new constitution, but there was never a law on the books on violence against women. And so they discussed for many years how they were going to write this law on violence against women, which was passed, it was in 2019. But in the course of discussing it, women in parliament were like, we also face violence, right? So they inserted a line in the law that recognizes violence against, women in politics as well. And I thought that was really interesting, right? Is because like they're bringing their own experiences to bear, right? Like as they're discussing this general law for, citizens, they could sort of see those experiences with what they were going through themselves. So I think, there's a lot of role for potential role for parliaments and women in parliaments in particular to sort of bring more attention and sort of spur data collection efforts in this way.
Yeah, thank you so much, Prof. Brooks. So we have to be able to collect the data, to advocate case of violence against women, and then try to recall bringing more voices from women as a source of knowledge, so that maybe our advocation will be more genuine. Thank you so much, Prof. And this is the second question, is from Ibu Francisca Widiawati from Unika Santo Paulus Ruteng in East Nusa Tenggara. Thanks for the great presentation. I have two questions. There were several female leaders such as Benazir Bhutto in Pakistan and Juana Quispe in Colombia who were killed. Is the violence experience in the past related to gender issues, or is it purely an issue of power struggle? Okay, that's how vulnerable are women to victims of violence in politics compared to men? Wow. And the second question is, apart from being victims of violence in the world of politics, women are also perpetrators of violence against fellow women and even against men. Is there a special pattern? So this is two questions. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, the case of Benazir Bhutto is very interesting. I have an article with Juliana Restrepo-Senin where we look very closely at the Bhutto case. It was one of three cases that we looked at in that article. And so this gets to that distinction I made between violence in politics and violence against women in politics, right? So there are definitely power struggles, political struggles that motivate some of the violence. But one of the things that we tried to develop was like a set of criteria for figuring out, like, is this something that's like sort of politically motivated versus identity motivated, gender motivated? And so we actually looked to research on hate crimes, because hate crimes, it's like, okay, somebody's something bad, but then their motivation is hatred of another ethnic group or, different kinds of groups. And so there's like legal guidance developed to try to figure out that bias or that hatred, right, was part of the motivation. And so we draw on that as a way of saying, how could we figure out that gender bias was somehow part of the act? And so, and sort of looking at this sort of balance of criteria, could we say this is an act of violence against women in politics, or is it just violence in politics? And in our analysis, we argue that the Bhutto case there are gendered aspects to her experience, but her assassination really does seem to be politically motivated. It's sort of in the violence in politics side of things. But, then there's some that are, I think, very, very much clearly violence against women in politics. An example we give is the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff in Brazil, the Brazilian president. So we think that as a case of violence against women in politics. And then there's sort of the case that's a little bit harder to figure out is the murder of Joe Cox, where there are some really good, there's good evidence suggests that it's politically motivated, but also very good evidence that it's gender motivated, right? So like, how do you balance those factors? So in the end, we think it tips towards the gender-based motivations. But it's one of these difficult cases to sort of pull apart those two aspects. So we think that there's, something to be a way of looking at cases and looking at the evidence and how to think about that. In terms of women perpetrators, that's absolutely 100%. I really want to avoid the impression that I think that, that men are the only perpetrators. It's often other women who are also part of that process. And it could be, women who are well known to the women, women members of their own parties, their mother-in-laws, right? Their mothers, their other female family members. So it's, I think we definitely do see that. And I don't think that undermines the idea that it's gender motivated, because, like work on sexual harassment says that, it's all about defending your position in the gender hierarchy, right? And so some women want to defend like traditional gender roles, right, and their position in the gender hierarchy, right? So they'll attack women who are trying to break that hierarchy, right? Break that I don't know, the positions that people have in society, because they feel like their own position is threatened by this woman who's breaking the rules, right? And so definitely women are part of the group of perpetrators, just like men. And men are also supporters of women in politics, the way that women may also be.
Thank you, Prof. Krog. Ibu Francisca, apakah do you want to say something?
No,
Yeah,
I think that's enough. Thank you, Prof. That's clear for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Bu Francisca. So next question is from Indah Kartika. Indah Kartika is in YouTube. So because we are open online as well in YouTube, Prof. So this is in YouTube. How to make politics for women, #not to cause. So how to make politics for women, #not to cause. Usually women fail because of money. How to make 50-50 for women in the parliament, and then which country the most success for women in politics, by Indah Kartika. So actually, I think she is interesting to follow up on the #not to cause. And the second one is because usually women fail because of the money, and this is also the case in Indonesia.
Mm-hmm.
And then how to make 50-50 for women in parliament, and then which country the most success for women in politics. That's all. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So with our hashtag, not the cost, we really think about it as like cost in a broad sense, right? Like that women need to suffer, right? I need to, just deal with this. This is like the price you pay for being a public figure. So we're using it in a very, like, I guess, non-literal way, right? Just thinking about the costs and benefits of doing anything. But the issue of women's finance is obviously very important and a huge part of explaining women's underrepresentation in many countries. But I think that where it matters a lot in the framework that I've discussed is economic violence, right? It's the fact that women don't have access to these resources makes them particularly vulnerable to withholding of economic resources, right? So like, burning down their house, right? Like, it's like, okay, it's not like you could just build it up again, right? Like breaking the windows in their office, it's not inexpensive, right, to fix. You also have cases in Latin America where, women are elected to the local councils, and then people who are involved, in charge of dispersing funds don't pay them, right? So they're not getting the salary, right? They're not getting like reimbursements, whereas the men are getting paid, men are getting their offices, men are getting cars and other things like this. And so it becomes like almost impossible because, if being a politician is a full-time job and you're not being paid for it, how can you feed your family? How can you, and I think it's when women don't have that sort of traditional backup resources, I think it makes those economic forms of violence very powerful and effective, right? It's hitting women where it really becomes difficult. And, there are cases where, it creates, conflicts with their husband. They're like, what, you've been working all this time and then you come back and there's not even any money for it, and it's because you're being denied because, some guy there is not willing to, is withholding your salary and things like that. So this is, I think, where it becomes really important. In terms of like the country with most women in politics, well, those are actually all over the world. There are actually 3 or 4 countries now that have more than 50% women in their parliament. And I think what's interesting, if you look at like the top 10 countries, it used to be like Europe and like Australia, New Zealand, and now it's, you know, African countries and Caribbean countries, Latin American countries, and some European countries thrown in there as well. So, and the big explanation for that has to do with gender quotas, which have really sort of jump-started women's entry into politics in many countries. So yeah, that's how I'd answer that.
Thank you so much, Prof. Crook. So I hope that's answered the question and the curiosity by Indah. And then next question is by, this is also in YouTube. How to equals in every sector of the humanities activity if the woman life always be underestimated by men? So how to equals in every sector of the humanity activities if the woman life always be underestimated by men? Always be an object of bullying and everything. So this is kind of maybe what you call her experience, or maybe her exploration on the surroundings life. So do you have any what you call respond on this, Prof. Crook?
Yeah, I have been my whole life underestimated, and I just love to prove people wrong. Can do it. I think that it's you know, I think this is where like a lot of young women feel this is where they are in politics too, right? You're sort of seen as someone who's, you know, inexperienced or underqualified, or not deserving of being there at the same time. And I think this is like the case of the US. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, you know, AOC, as she's known. Right, she was one of the youngest members of Congress, but she was also from an immigrant background. So she's Hispanic. She previously had like worked as a waitress, a bartender in a restaurant, right? So there's like a class background aspect of it. And I think that she's really proven all of the people who try to underestimate her on those grounds. You know, she's one of the most visible voices of the Democratic Party. She's really a voice of millennials and Generation Z. In American politics. And, you know, she's finding like ways to connect to voters, especially young voters, in a way that we've never seen before, because she's using like social media and using ways of, you know, connecting to young people. So I think that, you know, women are underestimated, but there's ways in which, you know, we can try to fight back, I think, and show our worth and contributions. But I also think it's interesting, you know, in this context that, you know, even just having a few more women in politics sometimes really is seen as a threat, right? So people like overestimate maybe like your impact, right? That there is a worry, right? That like too many women are going to like change things around here too much, or, you know, women maybe won't listen to the men and, you know, follow what they're telling them to do. And so I think that a lot of that insecurity really motivates some of this violence, right? People don't like change, right? And they, even if they don't think you deserve to be there, you're there, and then, you know, you need to be taken out. And so I think it really speaks to seeing the power of women, right, to potentially change things as well.
Yeah, thank you for very encouraging suggestion and experiences, Prof. Crook. And then, wow, this is another question. We have many questions here. So this question is from Ibu Yeryana, Perempuan Aman, Dayak Mayaan, Kalimantan. So it's from Borneo. She's come from Adat community. How can Indonesian indigenous women faith be improved so they can be included in the political process? With regard to the educational qualification and associated costs, becoming a candidate is quite challenging. Additionally, certain places maintain a patriarchal structure, preventing indigenous women from becoming candidate for political leadership at the village and higher level due to adat or customary law. Yeah. Are there any action that can be taken towards solidarity, such as assisting the process or enhancing the political skill of indigenous women? Currently, many policy does not provide justice and opportunities for indigenous women. So maybe Prof. Crook have any experiences working with indigenous women? Yeah, have some suggestion or answer.
Yeah, I do have some thoughts. In the United States, that we elected the first first Indigenous women to our Congress only in 2018. One of my former students, she worked with one of them, Deb Holland, who's now the Interior Secretary, working on a lot of like land issues and environment issues, things that were really important to the Indigenous communities that she represents. I think that, this is a question of like, multiple forms of marginalization. And I think the way that I think about it is that, it's like the multiple disadvantages, right? It makes it more difficult for people who have multiple marginalizations to break through, right? Because they experience discrimination in multiple ways, right? Which, shape their, life opportunities, like you said, education, or their financial abilities. And I think, it's not just patriarchy, it's often like racism or religious discrimination, or, these other elements. So I know some of the things that I think have helped in some countries have been, quotas for both Indigenous people as well as for women. Sometimes Indigenous women will, benefit from being members of both groups. I think networking is really important. I find this network of locally elected women in in Bolivia to be really interesting. They're known as ACOBOL, which is like the local counselors network. And, Bolivia is like a majority Indigenous country. And they also have a 50% gender quota. But these were like women, especially in the rural areas, they were like, the gender quota was requiring that women be elected to these local councils. But as soon as they're elected, they face all this backlash and resistance and violence. And they started to talk to each other about their experiences, right? And this is where they started to think about this issue. Like they named it political harassment and violence against women. And they, come together, they started to like collect data, creating like a reporting system. They they reached out to people in Congress. They held like a number of hearings, and they drafted this bill, right? This is like the first law in the world on this issue. And it's like, in the section on psychological violence, it's like pages. And you could just imagine, like they were telling their stories, right? They were like, okay, like it also includes like, for example, this, for example, that, for example, that. And I think it was a lot about, their networking, right? And supporting each other. And the fact that they were able to mobilize for this reform. I mean, it did take 10 years for it to go through the system, and, Juana Quispe's murder, right? Like kind of was the final catalyst for this. But I think there's ways in which Indigenous women work really well together, right? To try to combat some of these issues. But I think it is very difficult, right? When you face discrimination of multiple types or lack resources because of personal identities as well.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Prof. Mudah-mudahan menjawab ya, Bu ya. And then we still have 4 questions in here in row. So I think there is one person who would like to ask question directly. Ibu Sonia Selang from East Nusa Tenggara. Do you want to talk directly? You can use your mic. Yeah, Bu Sonia, can you speak English or you need some help? You still muted.
Okay.
Okay, you can talk directly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Prof, introduce me, Sonia from Kupang, Nusa Tenggara. I want to ask a question. In a democracy, women are really even given to opportunity to ask questions and make decision. How do you respond to democracy and momentarily even given the opportunity to ask question and make decision? And how do you respond? That is.
Sorry, I don't know if it's my internet connection. I didn't quite hear all of that.
Okay,
Maybe someone heard it better than me.
Yeah. Mbak Sonya dalam bahasa Indonesia bagaimana Mbak? Mungkin saya bisa membantu. Mungkin di unmute dulu Mbak. Ya, dalam bahasa Indonesia nanti saya.
Ya, saya ingin bertanya dalam berdemokrasi perempuan, demokrasi dalam adat ataupun demokrasi nasional maupun tingkat provinsi, kadang perempuan itu jarang diberi kesempatan untuk bertanya dan mengambil keputusan. Sering saya menemukannya di beberapa pertemuan adat, khususnya kami perempuan adat di desa-desa, kami jarang diberikan kesempatan untuk menyuarakan pendapat kami, bahkan tidak pernah sih diberikan kesempatan untuk sama-sama mengambil keputusan dalam berdemokrasi. Nah, bagaimana tanggapan dari ya?
Okay, so Prof. Kruk, Ibu Sonya Selan from East Nusa Tenggara asking questions that she actually, according to her experience, she as a woman rarely being giving a chance to just ask question during the customary meeting in the villages or during the higher meeting in the village or parliamentary meetings. So she kind of said why as a woman of indigenous woman in her own community, she doesn't provide it enough or same opportunity as men. So she would like to ask your opinion, and maybe you have any experiences with the same cases or not. Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting question, right? Because like, how do we give voice not just to elected women, but to like just women in the community? And the case that I think about immediately is some research that my colleagues have done on India. So in India, there's a constitutional provision to have at least 33% women on all local councils. So they reserve seats for women. And they also reserve, like in a collection of districts, 1/3 of the like the mayor position also for women. And so some communities have like had a woman mayor and some have not, right? So you can kind of compare the experiences of places where they've had a woman mayor 2 times maybe versus 1 time versus not at all. And so they found that in places where there was a woman mayor, that village women were more likely to attend meetings, public meetings. They're also more likely to speak during those meetings. And so I thought that was interesting finding, because it sort of suggested that, if women do nothing else, right, like that being a woman in that position can have like some important, symbolic effects, right? It sort of shows that politics is a place for women, right? And I think this is where having Indigenous women in that position, right? Or in India, there's women from these special castes and tribes as well, right? They're in these positions and they're breaking multiple barriers, right, with their presence. And so, but I think this is, difficult, right? Because it's like we're entering politics. It's like the system's already been set up, right? There are already like existing dynamics, existing rules. And so it's not like a automatic, easy thing to change, right? But I think that we can do that maybe by, bringing women into these higher level leadership positions, right? It won't be seamless, right? Because this is where the violence happens. But I think it's just really important, for signaling that politics is a place for women.
Yeah, thank you so much, Prof. And if I take a note on your definition of violence, I don't know, maybe what happened with Ibu Sonya is kind of has psychological violence, yeah, because the man surrounding her doesn't allow her to just speak during the meeting, and her voices was not heard. So a kind of psychological violence, which is not can not everybody feel that kind of violence. Like you say, maybe not everybody aware of this violence against women in politics. And when she talks today, actually a kind of a good sign that actually aware of this kind of violence against women in politics, in everyday life, not only in parliament. Yeah.
Yeah, I would also say, like, the other example I could think about was like there are some cases that I studied in Afghanistan where, you know, women would be talking and they would turn off their microphones, right? So it was like, so they couldn't speak, or like there was a woman member of parliament, because she was very vocal. They basically removed her from her seat. First they wouldn't let her speak, and then they actually like impeached her, took her out, even though there was no reason for it. It's just that she was like a very vocal woman. I guess they didn't like what she had to say. So, you know, I think that's definitely an example. And Juliana, my colleague, has also seen that in some Latin American cases as well. So like women are elected, but then they're unable to fully like participate in the debates, right? And so of course that's another challenge to democracy, right? Because, and it's not just the woman's right to speak, it's about the people who elected her, right? Like their right to be represented is also challenged when those kinds of behaviors happen.
Yeah, this really clearly explain us how the violence against women in politics will undermining the democracy. Yeah, we still have some questions. I have to read this. This one is from Triana Ahdiati. Thank you for the presentation. I'm just wondering, is there any specific model of violence toward women based on the sexual orientation, especially those who want to run for the socio-political candidacy? If yes, then what would probably be the reason be? Thank you very much. So you get the question, Prof, or I should?
Yeah, I think that this is something that people often ask me about, and we don't know as much about this question. And I think that a colleague of mine just wrote in Princeton here, it's just been like trying just to collect data on candidates and elected officials who are, LGBT candidates. And so we don't know very much about, how many there are, right? We don't know all about their experiences related to their sexual orientation and their gender identity. But I think that what I said before about like age and about ethnic background, right? I think that this also potentially applies in the case of sexuality as well. So there was a very well publicized case in the UK where Angela Eagle, who's a longstanding member of parliament for the Labour Party, she came forward as a potential leadership candidate and to challenge Jeremy Corbyn, who was a former party leader. And she was the first open lesbian in parliament. She got a lot of very homophobic attacks, in addition to sort of the sexist attacks. And then the political attacks for people who didn't like that she, was challenging Jeremy Corbyn. And so that's just an example that I know, but she's very open about her sexuality. So we're able to, and to talking about her experiences with violence. But I think that that's probably more widely spread. I would also just share that I had the opportunity to interview a trans woman in Mexico City years ago. And the instructions for like just going to the interview were very careful. It was like, they didn't give me the address. They told me like, go to this shop and then across there's a market, go to the end of the market and step out into a courtyard and then go on the stairs to the top of this building to the roof. And then, it was like, it was very complicated, and it was because of security, right? Like you couldn't just be like, hey, here's a trans candidate's office, because clearly they feared for physical security, So I think that's definitely a problem. We just know much less about it, but we could imagine, right? It's probably similar to the cases that we know.
Thank you, Prof. Krok. Yeah, this is also important development. Yeah, we have to look at. And then this question is from Yolanda Panjaitan from Cakra Wikara, Indonesia. We have been doing research on women in the legislature for many years. In recent years, we did a study of 8 female heads of local government in Indonesia. Although we focus on their strategy to win or retain power, we can say that from their story, all of them experience various kind of violence. We are happy that BRIN, through Mbak Nia, start the important discussion of on violence against women. So this is kind of a tribute, or what we call congratulate for us, yeah, BRIN and IFIS, to have this kind of discussion on violence against women in politics. Thank you for your presentation, Prof. Krop. I have a question. Is there an instance you can tell us where effort to tackle violence against women created positive result, or decreasing level of violence against women, or increase awareness? Where is it and what types of effort? So she would like to know kind of best practice, I think.
Right. So that question was about when women spoke up about it, or?
I think it's example what kind of effort to tackle violence against women in which the example created positive result to decrease the level of violence against women. Do you have any example that that's successful?
Yeah, you know, it's hard to know, right? Because we don't really have a baseline, and it's still very much a hidden problem. So it's hard to know, like, if it's becoming more common or getting less common. But I think one of the questions that people often raise when I talk about this topic is, if we talk about violence against women in politics, will we stop women from wanting to participate in politics, right? So like maybe there's like a negative effect of talking about the issue, right? Because it scares women away from politics. But one of the things I've observed with the women I interviewed, and, you know, the testimonies that I've read, is that, you know, a lot of women experience this violence. Some of them leave politics or think about it seriously, but a lot of women say it actually makes them want to stay, because clearly it matters that they're there, right? And so they feel like I'm saying something important, that's why people want me to leave, right? So like they actually get more confident about staying in politics. And this also happens for other women. So I think it was 2018, there was a local councilor in Rio in Brazil who was killed. Her name was Marielle Franco. And she was Black, and she was a lesbian, and she was a woman, and she was from a poor neighborhood, and she was killed. And there were huge demonstrations afterwards, and people, you know, really got mobilized about her murder. And in the next elections, you had unprecedented numbers of Black women running for political office, right? So rather than like getting the message that was sent about when they killed Marielle, they said, you know, that makes me think it's really important for Black women to be in politics. So I think it was like, it ended up having a sort of like, you know, we're not going to be scared away, right? We're going to participate even more than we did before that act tried to scare us away. So I think in that sense, that is like, you know, it can inspire women's participation, not just undermine it.
Thank you so much, Prof. Krop. We still have some questions. So this one is from YouTube by Mbak Anna Windarsi. What do you think the chance of female candidate in the 2024 presidential election? I think this one is Indonesia, so she asking about your thoughts. What do you think the chance of female candidate in the 2024 presidential election? And at the G20 event, there were two great women behind the success of the event. So I think she asking your question as well about the leadership of female behind the G20 success.
All right, so this is a question about American politics. Yeah, okay. This is a question about American politics.
Yeah, I think you can answer. Yeah, about American politics.
Yeah. No, so it's really interesting, because I've been working on an article about violence against women in American politics, because Nancy Pelosi, who's the current Speaker of the House, you might have heard that there was an attack on her home where the the intruder really hit her, attacked her husband physically, and he was looking for her. And so we have like a lot of, I think, growing examples of violence against women in politics in the United States. And I think Nancy Pelosi is one of those. And I think it's not surprising. She's like, of all the types of violence, I can identify examples that she's suffered. And I think it's not surprising because she's like the most powerful woman in American politics. And she's been the most powerful woman, since 2004 or so, when she first became speaker. Of course, Kamala Harris, I guess, is now, but she's also highly targeted as a politician. But I think, Nancy Pelosi is even more visible. And so there's, I think a lot of, discussion about what it means for her to be stepping down as sort of party leader. It's hard to know what's going to happen, but, I think that a lot of polarization happening in the US that is also connected to gender. I think that the Republican Party, sort of their model of political engagement is very sort of masculine and like masculinized and almost toxic. So it's like, these very sort of like macho or posturing types of people. So I don't really think there probably won't be a viable female candidate coming out of the Republican Party. And so far we think that Joe Biden will run again. He says he will. So I don't think there'll be a woman in the running unless he steps back and then somebody like Kamala Harris comes in. But I do think, though, in other levels of government, there's a lot of positive developments. Like we have never seen so many women running for office and winning office, diverse women, right? So Native women, like Indigenous women and Black women and young women, trans women, it's just a whole range of different groups. And that's really been in the last like 5 years. And so that's been a really exciting time to watch American politics and how much it's changing in such a rapid, quick way. And that is very much a legacy of Donald Trump and his, white male, rich man, persona. I think that people realize it's important to be involved in politics because elections do matter. And it's important for diverse people to be involved.
Thank you so much, Prof. Crook. We still have some time, and then there is another questions by Nur Aziza. Prof. Crook, in Indonesia, it is very difficult to raise women issues in politics. For example, in presidential election campaign, most people talk about identity, religion, and etc., but not the program related to women issues. Do you have any suggestion how to raise women's issues in Indonesian politics? Maybe example from USA, perhaps.
I think that like just based on what I've seen around the world, I think that the best way to bring attention to those issues is often to point out that they don't just benefit women, right? That it actually, often benefits men for us to pay attention to these issues. I think it also often involves women themselves mobilizing to sort of highlight these issues, like inside the parties, outside the parties, outside the political system, and sort of making it an issue. I think that's it's the kind of thing that I say it's the change doesn't happen on its own, right? That we often have to mobilize for the things that we want to see in public life. But of course, we're not always successful in doing that. But I think that, some of the most effective strategies have been those that really highlight that, it's important to invest in girls' education because it actually improves, like the human resources of the country, right, which improves development outcomes, for example. And so to say that this is actually something that benefits everyone, I think is often like a good way of framing the issue.
Yeah, thank you so much, Prof. Crook. We still have one more question. What kind of example law in which successful to eradicate violence against women in politics. So she asking about what kind of example, is there any example of law in which successful to eradicate violence against women in politics?
Yeah, so this is, there are several laws and several proposed laws around the world. So they take a few different forms. So sometimes it's a standalone law. So like it's a law on violence against women in politics. So that's the case in Bolivia, for example. But in other cases, what they do is they take the existing violence against women law and they add this political component to it, or they take the electoral law and then put the gender violence bit into that. So in Mexico, they actually changed both the violence against women law and the electoral code at the same time to create this. So this basically legislation on violence against women in politics. So my colleague Juliana Restrepo-Sanin, she's actually working on a book on the legal reforms in Latin America. And we've talked about this quite a lot because Latin America is a region in the world where laws aren't always very effective, right? States don't have a lot of capacity to enforce the laws. So does it matter that there are these laws on the books? But the way that I think she feels and the way that I feel is that laws are still very important because they show that we recognize the problem, right? We give, this is an important issue that is worth like the state's attention, right? Congress's attention, Parliament's attention, and people across parties, right? Agree that this is an important issue. And because I think it can play an important role in sort of establishing what are the priorities of the state, but also like what are the values we hold as a society, right? And so it can have this important, say, like symbolic role in sort of recognizing the issue. I think legislation isn't the only way to go, right? Things like I mentioned, codes of conduct. So sometimes parliaments introduce those, sometimes electoral commissions introduce those, sometimes individual parties, right? Like what's the behavior they expect of members of their own party, right? So like those are regulations, right? But they're not laws, and they can be potentially effective, right? In doing that as well, I think. So I think, there's some pluses and minuses of pursuing a law, but I think there's some good reasons to do it. And some things that are, similar to laws that also exist as good practices.
Yeah, thank you so much, Prof. I have to check in the chat box. Okay, there is no question, but I have a question because I'm curious about this development in Indonesia. We are currently in this heated debate that actually most of the female politicians in Indonesia come from political dynasty. So I don't know whether this kind of things also happen in USA. And then I would like to connect it with your point that usually women lack of financial resources or backup is a kind of economic balance. And then you also mentioned that maybe women who lack of financial resources can be experience economic balance, but those who have traditional backup maybe can escape from this kind of economic balance. So connected to those women who come from political dynasty, do you think it is good or not? I mean, some women come from political dynasty, meaning they have this traditional backup, yeah. Maybe men also come from political dynasty as well, but maybe they less experience violence. So what do you think? Because some say that it is not good for having women come from political dynasty, but as you explained, this is also good because they have this traditional backbone, yeah, to overcoming the economic violence. Do you have any experience or suggestion or opinion? Yeah.
Yeah, it was an interesting question. I was once in a workshop where someone asked, are there certain women who are protected from experiencing the violence, right, that a normal woman in politics would face. And I did some research in India, and I actually realized that's exactly the case. I interviewed a couple of women from like very political dynasties. So there were women who'd gone very far in politics, but were from political families. And they were like, no, I never experienced that. Like, no one threatens me online. Nobody like calls my office and threatens me. You know, I don't experience that. And, you know, some women will say that, and then you probe and they're like, oh, well, actually, yes, I did, you know, like I do, you know, they were sort of like later realized that they were cases, they had experienced violence harassment. But I think that these political dynasty women, I actually think they're probably telling the truth, right? And I think it's because they are somehow protected, right? Because they belong to their family, they belong to their father or their husband or whoever it is, that I think, you know, they're sort of seen as representatives of the family and not like a woman politician, you know, a traditional woman politician. So I think they might be insulated a little bit more. But a counterexample, of course, would be somebody like Hillary Clinton in the United States, who you could like argue is part of a political dynasty, but not really, right? Because it's just her husband. But, you know, people use that connection as a reason to say that she wasn't qualified, that she didn't deserve to do it. And a lot of sexism, misogyny, a lot of semiotic violence against Hillary Clinton. But, you know, that wasn't like, you know, generations of the family being, you know, part of politics. So maybe that's a different case. But I think the India case probably a little bit closer to the Indonesian case in terms of how political dynasties matter in politics. And, you know, that this has been a way that a lot of women historically have gotten into parliament was through their family connection or, you know, to national leadership positions. So, so I think that's interesting. You know, it's a way that helps women get in, but maybe also potentially insulates them from violence, or at least the extent of violence experienced by other women in the same position.
Yeah, thank you so much, because this is current development in Indonesia, and we recall many discussion about this current trend, yeah, and then how we as a part of civil society able to produce more diverse background of female politicians that come from grassroots level rather than, you know, that's come from very elite political level. And then, yeah, this is a good discussion if you would like to connect it with the case of violence against women, and then 5 category of violence that you have noted to us. So I think this will be interesting topic for research and discussion in the near future in Indonesia. So before we close, do you have some closing talk, Prof. Group? Closing statement, yeah.
Yeah, I would just say this has been like, yeah, a great set of questions. I always talk about this for forever and ever. I feel really passionate about this topic. I think it shows why it's important that women participate in politics, and really like the challenge that women's participation is seen to pose, right, to the status quo. And I think that's, you know, a reason why we should try to support more women to come in, more diverse women to come into politics and public life, because it does really matter that they're there. And if it didn't matter, people wouldn't be committing acts of violence or trying to harass or intimidate them out of that space. And so I think that's like one lesson. And I think the second one is really, again, what I said before about, I think this is an issue that everyone can do something, right? Every tiny little effort helps the broader discussion. And I really think that, you know, we can all be messengers of this topic, and to raise awareness and to support women who, you know, believe women who are undergoing these experiences in politics. Because I mean, all these things are important for empowering women in politics in the fullest possible sense. So thank you for inviting me to talk about it.
Thank you so much, Prof. Kruk. So very wonderful talk today, and as well the closing statement. I just would like to help the audience to wrap up what is the highlighted point mentioned and raised by Professor Kruk and our discussion today. I think there are 4 important points that we can bring us together to our home. The first thing, Professor Crook highlighted that violence against women in politics is real. And I would recall we have to be aware of this problem and then bring our awareness of this kind of problem in our everyday life and everyday encounter. And then recognizing this violence against women in politics is a current problem, not only in the USA, but also in Indonesian politics. And then by recognizing, we as academia or as practitioner will be able to see what kind of what we call everyday encounter a kind of violence against women in politics, especially if we project it into 2024 general election in Indonesia. So as academia and practitioner, we should aware of this problem. And the second one is there is multiple form of marginalization usually faced by women in politics. In the discussion, we raise about gender, race, ethnicity, and how indigenous women facing violence against women in their life in different types. And the third one is how networking is important, networking among women in parliament or outside parliament. Prof. Crook also provide us with a kind of example of that, how networking is important. And then the last one, how the campaign to raise awareness on the violence against women in politics is important. So everybody can contribute on this campaign personally or institutionally by our own capacity. And hopefully someday in Indonesia, we can, raising this kind of awareness nationally, and perhaps someday there is some law that really recognizing the importance to eradicate violence against women in politics. Things that maybe we know, but we do not recognize this kind of violence against women in politics. So thank you so much for an eye-opener talk, Professor Crook, and all the audience for the very great questions today. I'm very happy and very honored to having Professor Crook and all the audience today. Really happy, and hopefully all the talk can inspire other people, more women and more men, to also tackle this issue in Indonesia especially. Thank you so much. So I give the time to MC. Back to you, Mbak Nufus.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dewi, and also Professor Crook for bringing us to a very fruitful and productive session today. And before we officially close our event, I would like to remind all the participants to please kindly fill the attendance form. And if you want to rewatch or you want to share today's event, you can access it through the YouTube channel of BRIN Indonesia. And well, we have come to the end of our occasion today, and on behalf of the committee, I would like to say thank you for your very active participation today. I hope you enjoy the discussion. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and see you on the next occasion.
Thank you so much, Professor Crook. Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.